All right. Good morning, psychology students. Now you should have page 4.3 Intro to Consciousness out so that you can take notes. If you don't, you should do that right now so that you can take notes as we go through this presentation. Today you're going to learn about what consciousness is, what its functions are, and then how we can describe different levels and different states of consciousness, along with some major questions we talk about with consciousness. So let's just think about a couple of questions. What are you thinking about right now? Well, hopefully it's this class, right? What about on your way to class today? You may have been thinking about this class, but you may have been thinking about your friends or what you're doing after school today. What were you thinking on your way to lunch yesterday? Do you remember? Many of you probably do because you were probably thinking about what you were going to do for lunch. But you may not remember the exact details. You may just remember, well, probably that's what I was thinking about. Now, one more for you. What were you thinking on your way to class Tuesday 2 weeks ago? Probably most of you don't remember. You may, because Tuesday 2 weeks ago may have been something really special. But most likely, that's something you don't remember at this point. Things like this, the information that we can access, goes along with our idea of what consciousness is. Consciousness is a state of awareness of ourself, our environment, and our physical states, such as hunger, thirst, if we're tired. It is the part of the mind we can access. And it does an important job in combining the mental processes in our mind with the reality of the world and our situation. So consciousness has an important job in making sure that the mental processes in our mind will help us survive, will help us thrive in the current environment that we are finding ourselves to be a part of. Now, a real quick overview of the history of consciousness. So, structuralism was the first branch of psychology to study consciousness, and hopefully you remember a little bit of this from the first unit, but this was in the late 1800s when psychology was first starting to become a science, and Wilhelm Wundt was interested in the structure of consciousness, and he had his students study consciousness through a research method he called introspection, where they would go and they would write down everything they were thinking all day long. And we talked about the fact that probably wasn't a very good research method. Around the same time, in the late 1800s, Freud was interested in the influence of the unconscious. And so he was the one who really kicked off studying what consciousness and the unconscious mind are and how they relate to each other and work together. And you hopefully remember that Freud's central theory of consciousness can be found in not the Titanic, but in the iceberg. And so we talked about how the top of the iceberg, Freud said, was like our conscious mind, and the bottom of the iceberg was like our unconscious mind, and it's way bigger and it was way more important. Now, in the 1920s to 1960s, behaviorism became the dominant psychological theory, and the behaviorists said that consciousness is something we cannot measure, it's not scientific, and they pretty much redefined psychology as the study of behavior, and they totally kicked out the mind and the idea of consciousness or the unconscious. And so for 40 years, there were a few psychologists who were still studying Freud's theories, but mostly people had turned to behaviorism and the idea that that is the way to do psychology. Now, in the 1960s and 1970s, we have a return of consciousness. And there were a few things that led to this. One of them was mind-altering drugs. So LSD was thought to allow people to explore their consciousness. Now, that is totally not true, just for the record, but it did help propel consciousness back into the field of psychology, but it wasn't the only thing. The other really important thing that happened at the same time was advanced brain imaging techniques that allowed psychologists to have that scientific way of studying what was going on in the brain. And this is when we really started to understand the parts of the brain, what different parts do. And so it allowed us to go back and study things that we had not really had access to. The other thing that brought consciousness back into psychology was cognitive science. And cognitive science deals with how we learn and how we think. And in the 1950s, cognitive science saw a revival not even a revival, but saw a kind of an introduction. That was when it came on the scene, as people were trying to build computers, and they really wanted to understand how our minds work so that they could build computers that would work in ways similar to our thought processes. So with the return of consciousness, it's led us to really be able to understand what it does for us and the role it plays in helping us function in life. And there are some major functions of consciousness. We will go through each of these, so don't feel like you have to write them down quickly right now, but consciousness does 4 things for us. It restricts our attention, it combines information, it manipulates ideas, and it allows us to interact with the environment. Now, as consciousness restricts our attention, it actually limits what you notice. And you guys watched the pay attention video, and so you saw that we really don't have the ability to pay deep attention to more than one thing at a time. And this actually helps us from feeling overwhelmed. It can be bad when we want to be able to do one thing at a time, but when we want to play a game on our phone while our teacher is talking. But in general, this is really an important thing, because imagine if your brain was just constantly switching from one thing to another thing to another thing. That would be really overwhelming. But it does mean that our brain is multitasking, and so you shouldn't be playing games right now. You should be thinking about this content and taking notes. Now, the second function of consciousness is the combination of information. Consciousness acts like a mental meeting place for our brain, and it allows us to link a variety of mental processes together. For example, when we feel joy at seeing the photo of a loved one, what is that doing? We're looking at that person, and we're thinking about all of the time we've spent with them, or all of the good times we've had, and we feel that joy and we feel that love, and we bring those things together. This actually helps improve our memory, because when we can combine experiences and sensations into one single event or one set of information, we can remember it more easily. So that's a really great tool for us that helps us survive in the world. Manipulation of ideas. Consciousness creates a mental model of the world based on our memories. So all of the memories we have go into our overall organization of information in our brain. And so then when we get new information, it allows us to built that and put that into old information, but it also allows us to bring past information to the surface. And so maybe we have to make a choice. This allows us to evaluate our different alternatives and think about, well, last time I did this, and here's how it turned out. And so maybe I want to do it a little bit different this next go round. And most importantly, it allows us to interact with our environment. We know that we have to process the information that our senses take to our brain. This allows us to make the best current information of sensory information that we can using what we know about the past. And again, it allows us to use the past to do better things in the present and interact with our world around us in the best way possible. Now, when we talk about consciousness, we tend to talk about it as either levels or states. Levels have to do with how far is something from our conscious awareness. How much consciousness is there? And to describe these, we actually use some of the terms that Freud first came up with, but we mean something a little different by them now. So full consciousness means, like, this is what you're really paying attention to. So right now, your full consciousness, hopefully, is on this video. It's what is dominant in your mind. Now, the preconscious are things that are like right there, and maybe there's something that your brain kind of keeps switching back to and thinking about while you're watching this video. Maybe it's something you're worried about, or maybe it's something that just happened that you're thinking about, and you're really trying to give your full consciousness to this video, but there's something that keeps trying to grab it away. That would be information in your preconsciousness. Also in the preconsciousness would be anything that we can go back and we can access if we wanted to. So let's say I asked you about, what you did for your last birthday. Well, that's something you could go back and access pretty quickly, and you're probably thinking about it now. So those would be things in your preconsciousness. The next level is the subconscious and the unconscious, or they're the same thing, and they're a little different now, our understanding, than what Freud originally said. Freud said these were things that we couldn't access, but in reality, they're things that now we describe as being things we can access, we just typically don't. So it might be hard to access. It might be that we have to really dig down and think about what some of those older memories are. And it may even be things that are influencing us that we don't really think about, but it's not like it's just off limits and we can't get to it. Oftentimes we can get to it. It just takes a little more work. And then the non-conscious are processes that just really don't require any attention on our part. So, for example, breathing typically falls in the non-conscious realm. Now, you can hold your breath. Go on, give it a try. Hold your breath. So, eventually, you're going to have to release that, and that's your non-conscious part of your mind forcing you to breathe so that you can live. Things like our heartbeat, our hair growing, all of those things happen without any conscious awareness. And we know our brain's really involved in those things, but we aren't aware of it. We don't really have to think about it or worry about it, which is pretty awesome, because imagine if when you walked, you had to think about every single muscle that had to contract for you to make a movement. Instead, we only really have to think about where it is we're going. And sometimes even that can fall into our unconscious if we really have something on our mind and we're just kind of moving without paying attention to where we're going. The other way we talk about consciousness is through states of consciousness. States of consciousness are how much clarity that exists in your experience of self and environment. So what in your environment reaches your consciousness? Because we know not everything does. And what kind of clarity exists around that information as it reaches your brain? So think for a minute. Just jot down or talk with your group. What are different states of consciousness that would change how accurate the information is around you that is making it to your brain? All right. Maybe these are some examples of things that you came up with, or maybe you had some different examples. But things such as using any kind of mind-altering drug or alcohol can change our state of consciousness. Caffeine makes us sometimes more aware of what is going on in our environment, so that changes our consciousness. Meditation, sleep, dreams, those are considered different states of consciousness. Even near-death experiences are considered a different state of consciousness. So those are just a few examples. Hypnosis is another one, and we will be in a couple of weeks experiencing hypnosis before we leave for this semester. So you will get to experience that altered state of consciousness. So as we talk about consciousness, again, we can talk about the levels of consciousness and the states of consciousness. Now, as we talk about consciousness, there are 3 questions that are really super important, and you're going to be reading an article in a few minutes, and in that article you're going to have to think about these different questions of consciousness. So really pay attention and make sure you understand these. So these are questions that as psychologists study consciousness, they're always trying to figure out. The first one is, when is consciousness this unified phenomenon, and when is it parallel processes? And so this goes back to that idea of what are things we can kind of multitask on, and what can our brain run while doing other things, and then when is it that all of our consciousness has to come together and really, really focus on a single path. So a unified phenomenon is something we really have to focus on and put everything into. Parallel processes are things that are kind of going on all at the same time. So for example, when you're driving, when you first learn to drive, it's like you really, really have to focus on every single thing you do, and it takes a lot of conscious attention. And that's one reason young people are actually more likely to get into wrecks, because you're having to focus on little things like, making sure you use your turn signal and making sure you put just the right pressure on the brake. And if you're driving a standard, making sure you're using the clutch properly. But eventually, those things can start becoming a little more automated and parallel. And you may think about those things, but not to the same, it's not needed at that same level of focus. So what are things that can go on together, and when do you really have to focus? Here's another little experiment you can try this, or you can try. And you have to start this at exactly the same time. That's part of the key. So at exactly the same time, with your right foot, draw a counterclockwise circle, and your right hand, write the number 3 on your paper, and see how that looks. Now, I'm not saying you couldn't do it, but probably your 3 does not look as good as your typical 3. Now, if you start your counterclockwise circle first, and then you start to add in the 3, it's really not that hard, because you start getting those parallel processes kicking in, and it can totally be done. It's not even a hard thing to do, but to try to start both at exactly the same time is going to affect the quality of your 3. So our conscious processing is less efficient, but more capable. Our conscious processing, we can only really do one thing at a time, but we can do some pretty amazing things when we put all of our conscious effort into one single task. And again, that lends to some of the challenges of multitasking. The second question is, what is the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind? Again, our consciousness allows us to access things that have happened in the past and make better choices in the present. So how is it that those two play together? Because that information from the past is probably not necessarily in the forefront of our consciousness, but yet we can still access it and use it to make better decisions even when we don't realize it. When are things becoming automated that free up our conscious mind to do more work? So again, back to the example of driving, as a lot of those tasks like turning your turn signal start to go into the unconscious and you do them without even thinking, it allows our conscious mind to focus on traffic and the kid that might run out in the road in front of us and which way will be the best way to drive home knowing the traffic patterns. So how do these two parts of our mind interplay together to make us a more functional human being? And the last central question of consciousness has to do with that relationship between the mind and the brain. And what is the difference in our physical self and our mental self? How are those two connected? How is it that physical processes and mental processes play together and work together and run together? What's going on with that relationship? And remember the mind-body problem. I gave you the example of what would happen if I took your brain out and put it in someone else's body, or what would happen if we took your brain out and we put it into a robot. Like, would that be you or would that be them? This is the kind of thing that would fall under the mind-body problem questions. But what is that relationship between mind and brain, and the mind being our mental self and the brain really being our physical self? All right, you guys are now going to move into reading an article, and it is a challenging article, but you guys are amazing and you're going to do really great with this. Instructions are in your packet, so make sure you follow the instructions. You're going to be doing some annotations, and it tells you how to do that. You're going to be pulling these 3 questions of consciousness into those annotations. So you're going to be looking for places where you really see, like, okay, here consciousness this is talking about us really, really focusing, and this is talking about things kind of running in the background on multiple paths. I want you to look for places where it talks about the relationship between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And then, what is the relationship between our brain and consciousness? Where does consciousness lie in the brain? It talks about that in several places in the article. So look for those as you read, and follow the instructions that are in your packet, and look at some of the recent research and questions at work in the field of psychology.